Hello, and welcome back to Cross Currents, my podcast. I'm Rashid Abu-Assam, your host in Houston, Texas. And today I and all other Democrats woke up this morning to the feeling of joy and happiness with Zoran Mamdani winning the election to be the new mayor of New York City, the first Muslim man to become mayor of New York City, which is home to the largest Jewish population anywhere in the world except for Israel. Many young Jews and progressive Jews voted for Mamdani because they know he's not anti-Jewish, he's not anti-Semitic, he's just pro-Palestinian, and he wants, Palestinians to have their homeland in Gaza and the West Bank. Older Jews supposedly voted against him and I guess voted for Cuomo, but it was a delight to see this huge Democratic turnout of voters, especially in New York City. So many people voted early, and Mamdani was just an unstoppable force. He was constantly campaigning every day of the week, going everywhere. He even stopped in at a gay nightclub at 1:00 in the morning, I think on Sunday morning, to get out the vote. And he's really, really something. He even did campaign ads in different languages. He did one in Arabic, which was excellent. I saw it online. So I'm really, really happy that he was elected mayor of New York City, despite the millions and millions and millions of dollars poured in against him and into the Cuomo campaign by these tech billionaires. So it just goes to show you, I think they spent like $94 million, which basically just went down the drain because they weren't able to stop Mamdani from being elected the new mayor of New York City. Other Democratic victories yesterday were with Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. She was elected the new governor of Virginia. She's a Democrat. Her lieutenant governor, Hamdani, I think is her last name. She's a Muslim American woman. In New Jersey, another woman was elected the new governor of New Jersey, and she's also a Democrat. So all in all, it's really been a good election for the Democrats. And in California, Proposition 50, which asked if Californians approved of a redistricting move, which would give 5 new seats to the Democrats in California, was approved overwhelmingly by the majority of Californians who voted. Unlike Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, who did not put it on the ballot for a popular referendum and instead rammed the measure through the Texas legislature in Austin. Of course, the Democrats put up a good fight, and all the Democratic politicians left the state earlier this year and went to Illinois, to Chicago, so that they couldn't be forced to vote on the measure. They managed to get it delayed for several weeks. When they finally went back to Texas, Governor Abbott called another session of the Texas legislature and was able to get it passed, since the Republicans hold the majority of the seats in Texas. So in Texas, they're going to redistrict various voting areas to give the Republicans more seats in the legislature. And it was done in a rather undemocratic way. Instead of going to the people and asking them for their opinion, he rammed it through the legislature. So at least Governor Gavin Newsom of California took the much more democratic route of putting it on the ballot in California as a Proposition 50, and it passed with resounding colors. Here in Texas, I voted yesterday. The ballot was very short. There was an empty seat for the 18th district in the U.S. House of Representatives that was filled by the former mayor of Houston, Mayor Sylvester, but he died while in office. Shin Menifee, a Democrat who was African American, leading with 28.9% of the vote. And right behind him is Amanda Edwards. She's also a Democrat with 25.6% of the vote. So that vote is going to go to a runoff. My district is not included in that district, in the 18th district, and it's a really weird shape. It's like this whole part of the suburbs north of Houston, and then the suburbs and areas to the west going down through downtown Houston, and then the same thing on the eastern side going down. So my district is right in the middle there. But we voted on many ballot measures. Proposition 1 was to give more funding to technical colleges, and we voted 69% for that. Only 31% voted against that. Proposition 2 to prohibit capital gains tax. 66% of Texans voted for that. Against that was 34%. Denial of bail, to require judges to deny bail to individuals accused of certain violent or sexual felony offenses. 61% voted for that. 39% voted against. Proposition number 4, to use sales tax for a water fund, to authorize the state legislature to allocate up to $1 billion in excess sales tax revenue to the state water fund. 71% voted for that. To prohibit taxes on securities transactions, 55% voted for that. 45% voted against it. A tax exemption for certain surviving spouses of veterans, 87% voted for that. 13% voted against it. To prohibit a tax on estates after somebody dies, 72% voted for it. 28% voted against. Tax exemption for income-producing property, 65% voted for that, 35% voted against it. Tax exemption for fire damage, 89% voted for it, 11% voted against it. Increased property tax exemption for the elderly and disabled, 78% voted for it, 22% against it. Increased general property tax exemption, 79% voted for it, 21% were against it. Establish a state dementia institute, to use $3 billion from the state's general fund to establish the Dementia Prevention and Research Institute of Texas. 69% voted for it, 31% voted against it. To prohibit non-citizens from voting, amend the state constitution to bar persons who are not citizens of the United States from voting in Texas elections. 72% of the voters voted yes, 28% voted against this. So, you would think that non-U.S. citizens would already be barred from voting in elections in Texas. I don't know why that's not in the state's constitution. But really, yesterday's elections across the country were, some people said it was a big blue wave of Democrats winning. And as somebody said online, it's more than a blue wave. It's a blue tsunami, and it's really a big indicator of what's going to happen in our next midterm elections next November, when I think the Democrats are really going to win overwhelmingly, and Trump is going to be, disappointed with the results, because already this is turning into a referendum on what people think about the Trump administration so far. We're nearly 1 year into his first year of his 4-year mandate. And already, we have inflation skyrocketing. Food prices are rising very much. Today, I went shopping at Kroger, and I was looking at, brand name cereals. And, this cereal that I usually buy was like $4.99 for like a small box. And then I looked at they had like a bigger box, and then they had like a giant box. And the giant box was like $6.49. So per serving, the giant box came out much cheaper than the regular size box. So I bought the giant box. But still, we have sticker shock when we go shopping. The only thing that I've seen remain consistent is the price of fresh chicken, because I always buy chicken legs to cook for my dog Penny. And that's been stable. I buy a tray of chicken legs and that usually costs around $6.50. So that hasn't really gone up in price, but the price of other things has gone up quite considerably. So that plus the fact that many Hispanic voters who voted for Trump last year to be president, I think are starting to abandon him, especially after seeing these horrible scenes of ICE agents being so violent on the streets of America, attacking so-called illegal immigrants and tackling them to the ground and handcuffing them and beating them in public and taking them away in vans, unmarked vans. And these agents don't wear any sort of uniform. They cover their faces. They don't have any identification. These are scenes out of a country that is run by a dictatorship. And I think we are, in the midst of, a Trump dictatorship, unfortunately. And that's, very disturbing. So I think our Hispanic voters are finally seeing the true face of the Trump administration and what that really means to anybody in America who looks foreign or who looks Hispanic. Even if they're U.S. citizens, they can get attacked in the streets by ICE agents. And even I've seen so many videos of American Latinos screaming, I'm an American citizen. I'm an American citizen, and they're screaming it with an American accent. And obviously they were born here and grew up here. And these agents don't care, it's only later that they, look at the person's driver's license and realize that the person was actually born in the U.S. and is a U.S. citizen. And then they let them go. But I mean, the humiliation and the physical violence that these Latino citizens of the U.S. have to go through is really terrible and shouldn't be happening in our country. Moving on now to the current government shutdown and all the travel problems that air travelers are having. TSA agents across the country have not been paid in more than a month because this shutdown has already reached more than a month. Of course, Republicans and President Trump keep trying to blame the Democrats for not coming to the table, but the Republicans have still not said what they're going to do about the Obamacare subsidies that are due to expire at the end of December of this year. The Democrats are holding out for that. They want some sort of agreement to be reached. And this week saw horrific lines of passengers here at Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport. People were standing in line to get through TSA for a minimum of 3 to 5 to 6 hours. And the line just went out of the terminal and around the terminal like 3 times. It was just horrific. People who said airlines had told them to arrive, 3 to 4 hours before their flights were missing their flights because they weren't able to get through TSA in time. And this is happening because many of these TSA agents are calling in sick because they're not being paid. So they're like, why should I go to work? They're just staying home instead. So I just saw a video on Instagram of a flight attendant who's based here in Houston, and she was appealing to the American public saying, don't travel now. It's a mess. People are not getting paid, and it's just not worth the hassle and the delays that you're going to encounter. Luckily for me, on my recent trip to Brazil, I was not affected by any TSA delays, but I was affected. I flew on Delta from Houston to Brasilia in Brazil, so I had to take, I think, 4 flights to get there. I flew Houston to Atlanta to Sao Paulo, then Sao Paulo to Brasilia, and that's 3 flights. And then the same thing, just going backwards, coming back. My flight going down to Brazil was fine. We arrived on time. I made my connection with no problems. Coming back to the U.S. from Brasilia, I was booked on a LATAM flight from Brasilia to Guarulhos. Delta owns, I think, 10 or 12% of LATAM, so that's why they're the airline that Delta uses for connections to get passengers to Sao Paulo. I got to the airport in plenty of time, like 3 hours ahead of schedule, or maybe even 4 hours before schedule. I checked in, everything was fine. Went to the Priority Pass lounge, which is super crowded as usual in Brasilia. It seems like everybody has access to it nowadays, so it's not really that relaxing. But I was able to sit there and have a glass of wine and just sort of chill out for a bit. And then when I got to my gate, we waited and waited, and they said our plane hadn't arrived yet. And then they said our plane was there, and we saw passengers getting off the flight, and we seemed all set to leave at 7 p.m., which was our scheduled departure time. And then suddenly they said, no, it's been delayed. And then finally, I went and spoke to one of the airline employees at the desk at the gate, and she said, they're changing the front tire of the airplane. And I was like, oh my God, what does that mean? So I went to the window and looked down at the plane because we were above it. And true enough, they were changing the wheel of the airplane. I told my co-travelers about this and they were amazed. So they ran to the window to look too. And one of them said to me, oh, it's amazing that the LATAM employee actually told you the truth, because they usually make up stories just to appease passengers. So we waited and waited, and it turned out, like 60 to 70% of the passengers on my flight had connecting international flights in Sao Paulo too. So we're all worried that we're going to miss our connections. We finally boarded our flight and took off 2 hours after the fact. So we took off at 9 p.m. We arrived in Sao Paulo. It takes like an hour and 20 minutes to fly to Sao Paulo from Brasilia. So we arrived there at around 10:30 p.m. My flight on Delta was leaving at, I think, 11:45 p.m. And in Sao Paulo, there's Terminal 2 and Terminal 3. Terminal 2 is for domestic flights, and then Terminal 3 is around 1.5 kilometers away. You can walk between the terminals. It's all enclosed, but there's no train like in Atlanta to take you to the other terminal. And it takes, like 20 or 25 minutes to walk from one terminal to the other. So what we did when we landed in Terminal 2, there was a shortcut we could take to go through passport control and security, which I did, and it was quite quick. And then I was in Terminal 2, and there was one of those huge golf carts with various seats for people. And I was the last person there, and I ran up to it, and they let me sit on the end with a flight attendant, and I had to carry my roll-on bag on my lap. And as we were leaving Terminal 2, going to Terminal 3, this is all inside the building, I could see through the window that there was a Delta plane at Terminal 2, which I thought was odd. I was like, why is there a Delta plane at Terminal 2? Anyways, I thought maybe this was a Delta flight to New York City, not the flight to Atlanta. So I went to Terminal 3 and then started to look for the Delta flight. I looked on the departure board. There was nothing written, no Delta plane to be seen. I looked on my app again and then saw that the gate number said, like 267. So I looked around and I was like, oh no, that must be in Terminal 2, because all the gates here start with 3, since we're in Terminal 3. So I looked around and I met another passenger, a Brazilian guy, and he said he was also looking for the Delta flight to Atlanta. And then we both said, well, I think we have to go back to Terminal 2. So we had to walk all the way back to Terminal 2, really, really fast. I'm 61 years old. I'm in pretty good shape for my age, but not in great shape. So I found it very tiring to do so. Once we arrived there, There was just 15 minutes left before they would close boarding. I was very irritated. I was sweaty. My heart was beating too much. I complained to one of the Delta employees, and she said, oh, it was an operational issue. That's why they changed the gates. And I said, yes, but nobody told us. I said there should have been somebody from Delta or from Latam telling us passengers as we got off the Brasilia flight that we had to stay in Terminal 2, that our Delta flight was actually there, not to go to Terminal 3. Nobody said that. We didn't get any special emails warning us that the gate had been changed from one terminal to the other. So I blame Delta for this, total incompetence on their part. They could have, saved us a lot of grief and sweat and anger if they had promptly told us this as soon as we arrived in Sao Paulo. I finally got on my flight. I asked one of the flight attendants why this had happened. I told her I was very angry. She just looked at me and didn't say anything. Nobody on Delta said, oh, we're sorry about the mix-up. We're sorry that you had to run between terminals. We hope this doesn't happen again. Nobody said anything. If just one flight attendant had told me, oh, look, I'm very sorry, sir, blah, 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 blah. We hope this doesn't happen again. It would have appeased me, but they didn't. And then later I saw that my Apple Watch told me that my resting heart rate had been very, very high that evening when I was on the flight coming back to the US. We arrived in Atlanta on time. I have global entry. So you just go up to this kiosk. It takes a picture of your face. If it recognizes you, like in 1 or 2 seconds, it says go. And then you walk over to a dedicated immigration officer, and he calls out your name. He said, Rashid Abou-Alsam, and I said, yes. And he said, welcome in. So you just walk in to the U.S. without ever having to show your U.S. passport. Of course, you have to undergo a background check with the U.S. government, and they fingerprint you and everything. But it's just so convenient and so fast. And actually, I had to wait much more time. I had to wait much more time for my bag to appear in Atlanta on the luggage carousel, but it did arrive relatively quickly. So I took my bag and then walked over to the area where you give your bags in for your connecting domestic flight, and that went well. And then we had to go through security again. And this time there was no TSA pre-check. There was no clear. And I think this is just for international passengers arriving in Atlanta and connecting to domestic flights. So we all had to go through just regular security, take off our belts, take out our laptops, go through that machine where you have to stand like this with your arms up. People operating the machine are not very nice. The woman complained to me that my pants were too low. And I said, well, I took my belt off. What do you expect? So I pulled them up a bit, and I was scanned twice. And on the second scan, I was free to go. In Atlanta is my least favorite airport in the US. It is huge. It is chaotic. Thankfully, they do have the train that takes you between all the terminals. Without it, it would be a nightmare. And I think most people would miss their flights. Took the train to my terminal, got there in plenty of time, sat at the gate, was able to go buy something to drink, and I got back in Houston. Okay. And Delta did not lose my suitcase like they did in April. So thank goodness for that. But really, if this government shutdown is still ongoing through Thanksgiving, travel is going to be a nightmare in the U.S. Already, President Trump has warned that huge parts of U.S. airspace may need to be closed down because of a lack of air traffic controllers. I'm sure many of them are also calling in sick because they haven't been paid. Also, in this government lockdown, it just looks like it's going to be a nightmare all around. Some sources are saying they think that an agreement could be reached as early as this week to end the government shutdown. I don't know how true that is. We'll have to wait and see. So that's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed my podcast. Please subscribe and like my podcast if you're watching this on YouTube. For others, you can find my podcast on Apple and on Spotify. See you next week. Bye-bye.